Nationalism is a very strong love of one's own country or national identity. And today I'd like to talk about musical expressions of nationalism, especially as they emerged during the 19th century. While composers had been using national ideas and perhaps folk dances and songs in their music for hundreds of years, in the 19th century they began to use these as a way of really expressing national identity and patriotism through music. This was inspired in part by a series of revolutions across Europe, as well as by the Romantic era, which really emphasized personal expression, which also could become expressions of national identity. In the 19th century, it started off with the French Revolution leading into the century, and then there was just this one revolution after another across Europe. Poland also was taken over by Russia, and in 1848 there was a series of revolutions in Czechoslovakia and various other countries. There was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the collapse of some different empires across Europe. And so as composers were exploring their own modes of expression and really trying to find their voice, they began to identify themselves very closely with their particular national and ethnic heritage. And so they wanted to find ways of expressing this love of country and this national identity through music. And you can see this in the music of, so many different composers. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about Chopin, Bedřich Smetana, Anton Dvorak, and then Louis Moreau Gottschalk from the United States. And so Chopin was the first from that particular list to really emerge as a composer. He moved from Warsaw in Poland to Paris in 1830, and he really, throughout his life, kept his love of his country, his love of Poland and the Polish heritage, even though he was he was the son of a French immigrant and then a Polish mother. He really had a sense of national identity. And he chose to express this through his piano music mainly. He did this in several different ways, but one of them was incorporating a lot of Polish national dances into his music. So he used mazurkas and then polonaise, and these have very distinct rhythms that were national to Poland and to those Polish dances. And when he was doing this, he was very aware of incorporating his Polish identity and heritage into his music, and his listeners were also very aware that it was, Polish sounds and folk dances in his music. And this was very different from a lot of the classical tradition where it was all based on specific forms like the sonata form and rondo form. He was taking some of those forms and classical ideas, but then really infusing them with national identity, as well as a lot of chromaticism and other ideas. But Chopin was really a leader in the nationalist movement, and his music is still known for being a national symbol for Poland. And as I said, I'd also like to talk a little bit about Bedřich Smetana. And he was a composer from Czechoslovakia. He was actually composing in the 1870s, which was after Czechoslovakia had become part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But Smetana was a very strong proponent of nationalism, and he wanted to express his love of his country and his homeland in music through different ways, but especially through the use of symphonic poems. And this is just a piece of orchestra music that is supposed to tell a story, almost like a poem. His most famous works were a set of 6 symphonic poems called Ma Vlast, which means my homeland. And each of them depicts one aspect of Czechoslovakia and of his national identity and just his homeland in general. One of them, the Moldau, is probably, maybe not, it's one of my favorite pieces. It's absolutely gorgeous, and its sense of nationalism is so strong. It depicts the Moldau River, which runs through Czechoslovakia, And it's just really a national symbol. And Smetana decided to depict this through the symphony and through the orchestra. And so he used a particular river theme that's very strong. It emerges from like flowing brooks, which he uses woodwinds and clarinets for, and then out comes the main river theme. And as you go through the piece, there's just a series of sights that you pass in sound, I guess. So you can hear him incorporate a folk dance into his music at when you're passing the rustic peasant wedding. And there's a place where he uses the sounds of like an ancient sort of a national theme to depict a castle that you're flowing past on the river and other sites along the way. And so through this, it's more than just showing the river, but it's showing again the heritage and the culture and the history of Czechoslovakia and his love of that, and also his desire to hold on to the national identity and not let it be lost to the Austro-Hungarian Empire or to any other powers who might try to take over the country. And so, again, in the 19th century, nationalism was really a way of expressing that national and cultural identity through music. Another leader of the nationalist movement was Antonin Dvorak, who was another Czech composer who was also working in the later 19th century. And he was able to express his national identity in some different ways than Smetana, rather than just trying to paint pictures through sound or use the symphonic poem format. He did a lot of quoting national melodies or using, pentatonic scales and folk songs in his music as a way of expressing really his Czech national identity. And he also is kind of known for expressing, I guess, U.S. nationalism in a way, because in the 1890s, he went to the United States and spent 3 years teaching at a conservatory. And while he was here, he was exposed to a lot of different sounds and different musical traditions. He really fell in love with some of the African American spirituals, and as well as spending some time out in Iowa at a settlement of Czech composers where he was exposed to some Native American melodies and sounds. And so he wanted to incorporate all of these into kind of a nationalist symphony for the United States, which he did with the New World Symphony. And it doesn't directly quote any like particular melodies, especially spirituals or anything, but it has so many of those sounds, and he created the melodies in this symphony so that they sound like the spirituals that he had fallen in love with, or like some of the Native American scales and sounds by using various harmonies and various types of scales in the piece. And in the second movement, the slow movement, he created a tune which became known as Goin' Home, and later words were added to the song, and it became kind of a spiritual and a song in the United States tradition, and it actually came from his particular symphony. So he was that successful in showing those nationalist ideas through the New World Symphony. So that was Antonin Dvorak. And then finally, I would like to talk about one other composer who really expressed nationalism in his music, and that is Louis Moreau Gottschalk. And he's a little different from the ones I've mentioned so far because Gottschalk was an American composer. He was born in New Orleans in 1829 and spent quite a bit of his life either living or touring across the United States, but he did study in Europe. And so he left for Europe when he was 13. But he was, as he got a little bit older and began to compose, he wanted to express his own culture and his own traditions through music, just like Chopin and Smetana, Dvorak, and many others. So he decided at first that he would use some of the melodies that he had grown up hearing as a child around New Orleans. So he used a lot of Creole melodies. He was also influenced by some of the African American melodies and especially rhythmic patterns that he had heard as a child. And so his music, which was for him an expression of nationalism, became kind of the exotic across Europe. But it was really known for showing, America through music. Bambula was a very popular one, as well as Le Bananier, which is the banana tree, and was based on a Creole melody that he had heard and known as a child. And then later in his life, Gottschalk returned to the United States and toured in the 1850s and then continued during the Civil War. And during that time, he created some of his most overt expressions of nationalism through music. One of them is the Battle Cry of Freedom, which sets the famous Civil War song Battle Cry of Freedom by George F. Root. And he said it for the piano. He made it a virtuosic composition, but he was writing it as an example of his support of the Union and of the Union cause during the Civil War. And he then performed it at concerts across the North throughout the war. Another piece that he wrote as an expression of nationalism was La Union, and it's a medley of several different patriotic pieces, and then he added transitions and some really fiery sections that sound like cannons and drums of war. It includes the Star Spangled Banner, it includes Hail Columbia, and then it ends with a juxtaposition of Yankee Doodle and Hail Columbia at the same time. So it's another really strong example of nationalism. He also even used music to express other nations, which kind of veers into exoticism a little bit, but he would travel a lot through the Caribbean and even into South America. And then he would use some of the melodies and the rhythms and sounds he heard from their music and incorporate it into his piano music. And I would love if I had a little more time to play some of those pieces for you. But I just wanted to briefly introduce you to nationalism in music during the 19th century.